When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he'd reach out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness, and the days more grey each one than what had gone before, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. His hand rose and fell softly with each precious breath. He pushed away the plastic tarpaulin and raised himself in the stinking robes and blankets and looked toward the east for any light, but there was none. In the dream from which he'd wakened, he had wandered in a cave where the child led him by the hand, their light playing over the wet flowstone walls, like pilgrims in a fable swallowed up and lost among the inward parts of some granitic beast. Deep stone flues where the water dripped and sang, tolling in the silence the minutes of the earth and the hours and the days of it and the years without cease, until they stood in a great stone room where lay a black and ancient lake, and on the far shore a creature that raised its dripping mouth from the rimstone pool and stared into the light with eyes dead white and sightless as the eggs of spiders. It swung its head low over the water as if to take the scent of what it could not see, crouching there pale and naked and translucent, its alabaster bones cast up in shadow on the rocks behind it, its bowels, its beating heart. The brain that pulsed in a dull glass bell, it swung its head from side to side and then gave out a low moan and turned and lurched away and loped soundlessly into the dark. With the first grey light, he rose and left the boy sleeping and walked out to the road and squatted and studied the country to the south, barren, silent, godless. He thought the month was October, but he wasn't sure. He hadn't kept a calendar for years. They were moving south. There'd be no surviving another winter here. When it was light enough to use the binoculars, he glassed the valley below, everything paling away into the murk, the soft ash blowing in loose swirls over the blacktop. He studied what he could see, the segments of road down there among the dead trees, looking for anything of colour, any movement, any trace of standing smoke. He lowered the glasses and pulled down the cotton mask from his face and wiped his nose on the back of his wrist and then glassed the country again. Then he just sat there holding the binoculars and watching the ashen daylight congeal over the land. He knew only that the child was his warrant. He said, "If he is not the word of God, God never spoke." So opens Cormac McCarthy's 2006 post-apocalyptic novel, The Road, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, I believe, the following year in 2007. It was my first Cormac McCarthy, which I would have read in 2009, just before I went to see the film. I happened to pick up actually this copy in a charity shop, very cheap at the time. So it was my first Cormac McCarthy, and it wasn't the best place to start, and I still don't think it is, for reasons which I'll get to. But I'll go through the plot first. It's an extremely simplistic plot, sort of on paper, so to speak. In terms of just the narrative, it follows two unnamed protagonists, the man and the boy, or the child. And it follows them, the man and the boy, but child is also a key theme in terms of a child of God, in the notion of being a child of God in such a world, which I'll get to. But it follows a man and his son as they journey across a post-apocalyptic America, which is now just a stateless waste, an ashen waste, where the event unto which, the reason as to why the world as it is, which is one of the most horrendously, cosmically void and death-filled worlds imaginable and probably put to paper. And John Hillcoat's film, The Road of 2009, does an astounding job of portraying that world. But of course, McCarthy's descriptions are superior because the style. This is an extremely minimal novel, minimalist in style, especially for McCarthy. But it follows the man and his son as they journey south to try to get to the sea. It's not explicitly explained as to why they want to head in this direction. I think, the tale itself does mirror Dante's Inferno in some sense, as an allegorical journey, and so the sense of this movement towards the south, towards the sea, as some possible catharsis or possibly even like revelation in terms of what they're even doing in this world, is perhaps the only reason that's needed in the absolute barren hellscape which is the road. The narrative is sort of peppered with very short flashbacks to the man's life, some small snippets to before whatever the event is. I don't think we need to focus on the event. It's sort of missing the moon by looking at the finger pointing to it to try figure out what it is. Some people would say it's the Yellowstone Mountains. Some people think like the sun has been blotted out. I don't think it explicitly matters in an empirical sense. Once again, another thing that I will get to. But the narrative that's the basic narrative, and as they move forward, you come to understand the absolute hellishness of the world, rife with not only what we could call biological survival problems of food, water, shelter, which are all pushed to their absolute terminal peak. The world is such that clearly nothing can grow. The water needs to be purified. Everything's covered in sort of an ashen black rain. Everything's murky. Everything's wet. There's lightning. There's storms. There's constant rain. Nothing is growing. So what you're relying on as a human being is basically just remnants. And this, in a way, also brings it to the further conclusion of survival in a world no longer meant for humans, which is another thing I will get to, is that what humans eventually have to start doing is becoming cannibals, eating themselves. And this is one of the great worries of the man is running into cannibals in a moralistic, in a moral sense. They witness a sort of a band of really the worst you can imagine of what humans are capable of. Blood cults on memories of blood cults on ridgeways and mountain paths, and fires on them in the mountains. Just a vague sense of complete despair and desperation, and really hell on earth. Alongside at one point witnessing a sort of a wagon drawn by slaves, followed by pregnant women and catamites, protected by men with leather clubs and what seems to be whips. A vision of pure hell. And all amidst this is a father trying to really find a reason. He thinks, and this is my own, I guess, analysis here, he thinks he's trying to find a reason to give the child to stay alive, his son. But I think he's constantly, reciprocally trying to find a reason as to why to continue for himself altogether. The child being born into this world, as is made evident, the child holds what we could call once again, we'll get to the Gnosticism, but in a Gnostic sense, the sociological innocence which has been implanted as the divine spark. The child holds this innately and hasn't had to weather the transition from the modern world, or the world which is long since gone, through to the hell that they are now in. There's a lot of excerpts that I want to read throughout this, which will hopefully just give an impression of the book, and then I will further into my analysis. But the other key events really are, and spoilers alert, at one point the father and son stumble across a bunker full of food, this sort of small glimmer of hope. But you as the reader, I mean, for me personally, I found this moment where they literally stumble almost as an act of divine grace, in my opinion, because the father walks back towards this house where they'd already been for no discernible reason, sort of an intuitive feeling that something is there, discovers this bunker. But I think as the reader, you know that, well, how long is this bunker going to last? And it's like too good for this world, and it's going to give you too much hope within the world that you are acknowledging that you're within. You almost don't want it, because it's you know, you've been going through a world where they're eating basically just cold beans out of a can under a rainy, murky, ashen highway or bridge or something along these lines, soaked to the bone and covered in blankets and making horrible fires. And all of a sudden you're in a long forgotten bunker full of foods and tinned goods and richness, and the sweetness of that scene is kind of sickening. But that's one of the key scenes. It gives you some glimmer that might be something in this world going on that's more than this ashen hell. But there is also a scene where the father and the man and the boy come across a roving band of sort of mercenaries, who the father immediately there is just a complete acknowledgement that everything is a lie, that anything that they might say to them, that they are awful people, they are bad people. And one of the men walks away from the truck in this road and into the forest where the man and the boy have hid from, because they've heard them, and has to go to the loo. There's his reason for walking away from the truck, and spots the father and the son, and eventually this results in the father having to kill him to get away from them. I mean, this is really an acknowledgement of the other people in this world, and the father's inherent distrust of everything. Everything else has become the devil in the terms of it being the father of lies. Nothing they could say could ever be the truth, other than the only truth that there is for the man is between him and his son. The only truth for the man is between the man and the boy. There is the fairly horrific scene where they stumble across a house, and they go into the cellar to see if the man wonders why it's locked. Turns out that there is a group of naked people who have been with ashen stumps for limbs, as in their limbs have been cut off and burnt, because people are this is a cannibal den. They eventually sort of escape this. The cannibals then are close to catching them, but they eventually escape them. And then moving right through to the end, throughout the book, throughout the narrative, there's a couple of little glimpses that there may have been these other people near them, with the boy possibly seeing another little boy in the world, and the father, the man, sort of denying this thing. There's no little boy. And eventually the father gets ill for whatever reason. There is some hints as to why, but that doesn't massively matter. And he dies, and the boy waits with him for 3 days, and eventually a family comes along, and sort of they seem sincere. They have a family, they have a dog, and they want to take the boy under their protection and carry on. And the boy says goodbye to his father, which I will get to. So I will read a couple of other excerpts and then head in with some analysis. When they'd eaten, he took the boy out on the gravel bar below the bridge, and he pushed away the thin shore ice with a stick, and they knelt there while he washed the boy's face and his hair. The water was so cold the boy was crying. They moved down the gravel to find fresh water, and he washed his hair again as well as he could, and finally stopped because the boy was moaning with the cold of it. He dried him with the blanket, kneeling there in the glow of the light, with the shadow of the bridge's understructure broken across the palisade of tree trunks beyond the creek. "This is my child," he said. "I wash a dead man's brains out of his hair. That is my job." Then he wrapped him in the blanket and carried him to the fire. The boy sat tottering. The man watched him that he not topple into the flames. He kicked holes in the sand for the boy's hips and shoulders where he would sleep, and he sat holding him while he tousled his hair before the fire to dry it. All of this like some ancient anointing. So be it. Evoke the forms. Where you've nothing else, construct ceremonies out of the air and breathe upon them. And this is really the first thing in my analysis to acknowledge, is that in this way I think there's all of McCarthy's work fits within a certain world. I don't mean some sort of expanded universe or something like that, but there's a certain world that he's acknowledging, and I believe there is a progression in that world, but the progression is difficult for us to understand because it's nothing to do with us, and in that way there is a progression which we cannot understand. So something's moving, that's all we can really say. And in this way I think there's 3 books of McCarthy's, and the others fall into it most certainly, but there's 3 books which I think are key to acknowledge this trajectory. We have, in terms of the chronology within the worlds, we have Blood Meridian, the Western 1800s, the acknowledgement from the judge as the harbinger of what will eventually be this conclusion. The judge as the proto-apocalyptic archon who is imminently accepting and acknowledging of the world which is to come. The birth of that industrial, quantified, demythologized, denaturalized violence brought to the surface in other forms, non-primitive forms, and the judge as its representative, as its almost ambassador, is the beginning of the process which can end in no other way than the road. The road, I think in the McCarthyian vision, the road is an inevitability. And for many people who read McCarthy, the road, I think at first, this is, I only think the 3rd time I've read it, and since reading a lot of other McCarthy's work since, it was actually different this time. And the second time I read it so the first time I read it, it was my first McCarthy, so I didn't have much to compare it with, and also I was quite young. And the second time I read it, after reading some other McCarthy, it wasn't, I thought, this is kind of weak. And I've said in other podcasts that I find it his weakest work, and perhaps I'd retract that statement now, that its simplicity and its barrenness is needed for the form, and it's needed at the end of this trajectory. But you move through from Blood Meridian into something such as Sutri, where you're saying farewell to the forms which I think are present in that quote that I just mentioned, where he is now having to bring forms from nothingness. Someone such as Sutri is witnessing the death of certain myths, certain forms of time, certain understandings of the world. He's really, I think, witnessing the death of the sacred, and he's clutching to that almost like with his fingertips in a way which is eventually sort of abusing him and abusing his life, because he can't fully give himself over to the modern world. And so that trajectory is pushing through from Blood Meridian through to Sutri, and it can only ever culminate, I think, in something such as the road. What it really culminates in is, for McCarthy, you have a vision of geological time, as made clear in Nick Monk's work, who I interviewed before. So geological time, grand time, the time of mountains, the time of myths, the time of wolves, a time which is expanding beyond the human, beyond any measure that our minds could understand. And what we're left with is not the stereotypical world wherein man has been forgotten. We are left with an acknowledgement that the world never really cared for us, not in the way that we thought. And it's possibly our own carelessness, if one wanted to read into this in some atmospheric change due to our own problems sense, but I don't think that would be incorrect. It's a world where the cosmic apathy, the cosmic nothingness towards man, once again in that Gnostic sense of the world, to reiterate the Gnosticism which I think is prevalent in McCarthy and has been, once again I'm relying on Petra Mundik's book Bloody and Barbarous God, which analyzes primarily Blood Meridian in relation to the Gnosticism, but there is a great essay in there called All Things of Grace and Beauty, I think it's called, on the road in relation to this Gnosticism. So to go over the Gnostic idea once again, have the notion that the God, in the sense that we understand when we say God, the singular monotheistic God did create the world, but then there is or did create all things, but then there is a demiurge who created, this is very rough, demiurge, like a minor god in a way, once again very rough, a demiurge who created our world, and then in this sense, the material world is this sort of punishment. But if I've got this right, Sophia tricked the demiurge to get a divine spark into man as a means to escape this way of being. And I think it's a more pessimistic form of Gnosticism in this way, more pessimistic Gnostic vision, in that been completely forgotten. But in relation to that sophiological or snuck in divine light that you find within Gnosticism, it's the boy who holds this. This is what I was talking about earlier in relation to the man is imbued with he's almost cursed. All adults within this world are cursed because they are cursed with memory. They are cursed with memory, sentiment, nostalgia, relics, anything almost umbilical which is related to being able to acknowledge the things of the world as what they were meant to be. They're almost cursed with a phenomenology which is only available to them, and they would never actually want to explain it to anyone else. And so the almost like there's a moment where they find a can of Coca-Cola in a vending machine, and obviously to the man and to the boy, this is quite literally a different phenomenological object, and the man would not want to imbue the knowledge that he has of that world that he's had to move from to the boy. And it's in this sense that the morality of the novel and the hope of the novel is constantly flipping between the man and the boy, and it's a constant question of who is there's an allegorical theme of keeping the fire, holding the flame, and it seems that perhaps that relationship is reciprocal between the both of them, but it's made evident fairly quickly that the man needs the boy almost more than the boy needs the man. I mean, the boy is, of course, almost helpless. He's had no ability. He's a completely innocent child, in the sense of, once again, a child of God. Completely innocent in this world, and not necessarily naive, but full of love. He's constantly wanting to give people his food. He's constantly checking with his father, saying, "Are we the good guys? We're still the good guys. We're still carrying the flame. We're still carrying the fire." He wants to give people his food, but at the same time, this isn't, I don't think, a pure naivety, because the boy has been brought up in this world. He's not ignorant of what death is, because if we were to very roughly look at this in a Heideggerian sense, where Heidegger would state that we're pushing our past in front of us, and death is always pushing us from behind, and so the past and the future are flipped in that way. This is a flattened Heideggerianism where death is. There isn't a future sense of death. There isn't this mystical appreciation of death as some event that we are encroaching upon to learn from as fuel. Death is. Death has almost been done, and humans have been forgotten and left alone in the universe to such a degree that death has become something else altogether. I mean, death is everywhere. The animals are gone. They have all died. The child asks the man about his friends. He says they're all dead. There is dead bodies, burnt bodies, and even at one point a baby on a spit. The sanctity of life is null. And so in that sense, death is no longer the event of death, but it has become an imminent biological phenomenon alone. The boy it's been brought up in this world, and so his acknowledgement of wanting to be kind and caring and share things is not a naivety. He's well aware of this world, and any question that he needs to be redeemed or whether or not he's saved or something like this, I think would be it doesn't need to be. He has that spark, and it's the father who's perhaps struggling to reconcile that with the fact he's had to weather the move from the old world to the new. He's had to weather the move from when humans were to when they became a memory, and then to now where humans aren't. Humans are alien. There's constant reiterations of the man and the boy as being alien to their surroundings. Once again, in a Heideggerian sense, if we look at the terms such as being in the world, and the in of being in the world for Heidegger is the old German of Innan, which means a familiarity. So beings like humans, Dasein, and the world, there is an innate familiarity between the two. In my own analysis of this, in the road, the Innan has been ripped out. It's being and world, so it's now alien and world, and the world is almost shrugging humans off as a fever. There isn't this relation. There isn't the familiar relationship between man and the world anymore. So that's the world that they're within, and we'll go to another reading and then continue on with some analysis. They followed a stone wall past the remains of an orchard. The trees in their ordered rows gnarled and black, and the fallen limbs thick on the ground. He stopped and looked across the fields, wind in the east, the soft ash moving in the furrows, stopping, moving again. He'd seen it all before, shapes of dried blood in the stubble grass and grey coils of viscera where the slain had been field-dressed and hauled away. The wall beyond held a frieze of human heads, all faced alike, dried and caved, with their taut grins and shrunken eyes. They wore gold rings in their leather ears, and in the wind their sparse and ratty hair twisted about on their skulls. The teeth in their sockets like dental moulds, the crude tattoos etched in some home-brewed woad, faded in the beggared sunlight. Spiders, swords, targets, a dragon, runic slogans, creeds misspelled, old scars with old motifs stitched along their borders. The heads not truncheoned, shapeless, had been flayed of their skins, and the raw skulls painted and signed across the forehead in a scroll, and one white bone skull had the plate sutures etched carefully in ink, like a blueprint for assembly. He looked back at the boy, standing by the cart in the wind. He looked at the dry grass where it moved, and at the dark and twisted trees in their rows. A few shreds of clothing blown against the wall, everything grey in the ash. He walked along the wall, passing the masks in a last review, and through a stile and on to where the boy was waiting. He put his arm around his shoulder. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." Now, one thing that's some commentary, once again, this is emphasized by Petra Mundik in her book. Many commentators have mentioned that early on, of course, we love to know why things have happened. Almost this, can we avoid this? And McCarthy makes it very clear early on, like this isn't an anthropocentric extinction event. It's nothing like that. This is a spiritual event, I think. And there is a line from the man early on in the novel. He says, "The clocks stopped at 1:17." And many read into this Revelation 1:17 from the Bible. "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last.'" the second coming of Christ. Now, if we're to read into this, the clock stopped at 1:17 in the second coming of Christ. Are we to read that that hasn't happened? That those that are left this is hell. This is quite literally hell now. What of the boy in this sense for this this notion, if there's any truth to the second coming as having happened? But I think one theological perspective to take going into the road would be the death of God theology, in that some death of God theologians understanding that when Jesus Christ as incarnation, as God becoming man, there is certain understandings of this as death of God theology, wherein God becomes man and is then killed on the cross, as in a moment of, and I mean this not as crassly as it's going to come across, but in a theological, cosmological moment of, you are on your own. God literally, the immortal, eternal, infinite God, becomes finite and mortal and is crucified in the most horrific and embarrassing way, and man witnesses the death of God, as to say, God is gone. You are without God now. And the road is the terminal point downstream from that theologically death of God conclusion. A way to view that. This is what's coming from that. And it's in this way that this becomes a spiritually allegorical, it is a spiritually allegorical journey, which in my own opinion as well would be reminiscent of one of the sayings of Gurdjieff, where he mentions that men view the world upside down. And so we flip the spiritual hierarchy in this sense. We're on an allegorical journey, much like Dante, but we are in a world which has been flipped upside down, so the sacred is the profane and the profane is the sacred. And the boy seems to be the redeeming factor to not remind, but just as an acknowledgement of what hope can be in the worst of the worst. This is perhaps it's like the only novel where there can be hope, because there can be no worse world. And you can't have hope. There is a lack of empirical data, empirical names, signifiers, placements, with that form of knowledge of the world, hope becomes meaningless, because you have control, you have knowledge, you have understanding, you can move from your ability to anchor yourself within the world. You don't need hope in the sense of faith. But in the sense of the quotation that I mentioned from Gurdjieff, where he says that man views the world upside down, the world is flipped from this death of God theological standpoint, where God has quite literally died and is gone, and man is on his own. The conclusion becomes that everything has become flipped, and this is seen in the fact that there is an acknowledgement from the man, an acknowledgement also from the descriptive and narrative style of McCarthy, of an inverse Adamic language. So Adam in the Garden of Eden is almost given permission by God to name the animals. And he's not simply naming them like we would name an object like a pen. Say, well, that's pen, but we would know that's just a signifier. The Adamic language was the naming of the animals, but in the name and the language, whatever that was, which is almost like on par with the language of the angels, was the essence of the thing itself. Now, in an inverse relationship of this, where the world has been stripped of God, there can be no such language which allows that. And so what we see in the road is things named without any possible. There is no essence to these things. It's the absolute bare materialism of a horrid pessimistic Gnosticism, where each thing only is as it is. It is just an ashen hellscape. There isn't the hierarchical spiritual depth which would allow us to move in any direction. We could say that the road the road itself, and also the notion of a road as a flat horizontal, is the most horrifying vision of this novel. Because when we think of, and I do read this as a theological and spiritual novel, when we think of the symbolism of the cross, the simplicity of the symbolism of the cross is the vertical and the horizontal. The horizontal is the temporal aspect of man progressing through time, chronologically as we do, and the vertical as the higher and the lower. The lower being our base desires or our passions and our vices, and the higher is towards a higher thing. The road is a world in which the vertical isn't. The vertical, the option of the vertical has been removed due to what seems to be a cosmological atrocity, but it was no one's fault. This is the horrendous position that we've been placed in, and without that there can be no harmony, there can be no equilibrium. It is a singular movement, and the realization once again from that inverted Adamic language means you can't move in either direction, and you're simply moving forward. And this is primarily a problem for the man, because the man in the previous world where he was in, we could argue that the vertical of the cross was still within that world, but it's no longer here. But for the boy brings that with him. For the man, I think that's been destroyed. And so it's in that way that for the man, the world is always going to be cold. But for the boy, it's very difficult for us to perceive the world from the child's lens. But man's time is over. This is the difficult thing to accept from the novel. This isn't post-apocalyptic in the sense of a rebuilding, but there's a couple of little notions of that which I will get to very soon. Unlike other post-apocalyptic novels, perhaps where institutions are failing, or a comet, it's like, okay, well, the whole world's exploded, it's all over. A cog has been taken out from the possibility of... A cog has been taken out from equilibrium, and now equilibrium and harmony within the universe is not, in the cosmos is not. But maybe it is for everything else. Now our time is done, and it's almost like someone's a horrendous archon somewhere has brushed their hands and said, well, we're done with Earth now, but is so malevolently ignorant of human beings that those that were left are just left to their own devices. And when we're left to our own devices, it is the culmination of that death of God theology flowing through Blood Meridian, flowing through the world in Blood Meridian, where we see that astrology has been wiped away, animals have been wiped away, myth has been wiped away, through to Sutri, where we're almost like reliant on technology, which even in that in that book, as with like the beginning of The Orchard Keeper, McCarthy's first novel, where barbed wire is growing into the tree. That is to say that process where everything is dead, mechanical, has been growing into and through those larger structures which can imbue the world with meaning. We are left with the conclusion of that which we knew would have been all along, and this is where we're at. But there is hope, and this is why for many the road sits strange, because the ending of the majority of McCarthy's novels isn't hopeful in that sense. It often leaves things open to analysis, but The Road is emphatically a novel where there's a hopeful ending. Some people would consider it a failure, or at least a McCarthyan failure in this sense. I mean, for those that are very sympathetic to McCarthy's pessimism, most certainly, the idea that the sounds and the things that the boy might have seen actually did happen to be true, and that there is from somewhere a man, his wife, and 2 children, a family that happened to come along as the boy's father just dies, and he seems to be in safe hands. And this isn't written in the sense where you think, oh, what's going to happen? It's fairly clear that this is the real deal, and he's still within that world, but someone is going to be protecting him. And certainly it's a hopeful ending. Whether or not this this book was written, really a lot of it was written because McCarthy was having conversations with his young son about what I think it was El Paso would look like in 50 to 100 years, and having a newborn child or a young child and thinking about protecting them in this world. And perhaps McCarthy couldn't allow his pessimism when it came to thinking about the future of his own children. Maybe that's why. It's completely understandable. But for many people, it falls a little bit flat at the end there because of that, because it just doesn't seem to fit. That why is McCarthy giving us this hopeful ending? Whether or not it's hopeful, whether or not there's hope in the maybe in the Christian sense, is a matter of debate and a matter of discussion. But I'll just finish up here with the ending of the book. He waited in the road, and when the man came out of the woods, he was carrying the suitcase, and he had the blankets over his shoulder. He sorted through them and handed one to the boy. "Here," he said, "wrap this around you. You're cold." The boy tried to hand him the pistol, but he wouldn't take it. "You hold on to that," he said. "Okay." "Do you know how to shoot it?" "Yes." "Okay. What about my papa?" "There's nothing else to be done. I think I want to say goodbye to him." "Will you be all right?" "Yes." "Go ahead, I'll wait for you." He walked back into the woods and knelt beside his father. He was wrapped in a blanket, as the man had promised, and the boy didn't uncover him, but he sat beside him and he was crying and he couldn't stop. He cried for a long time. "I'll talk to you every day," he whispered, "and I won't forget, no matter what." Then he rose and turned and walked back out to the road. The woman, when she saw him, put her arms around him and held him. "Oh," she said, "I'm so glad to see you." She would talk to him sometimes about God. He tried to talk to God, but the best thing was to talk to his father, and he did talk to him, and he didn't forget. The woman said that was all right. She said that the breath of God was his breath, yet though it passed from man to man through all of time. Once there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current, where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world and its becoming, maps and mazes, of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery. And so ends the road, and so ends the boy with the new family. And it is not the end of McCarthy's writing, as we have The Passenger and Stella Maris, which I'll get to at some point, but I need much more time with them. Though there, as I've been told, the manuscripts, the drafts for those novels were in the archives and written possibly before The Road, though I may have not got that correct, but apparently that's true. And so The Road does seem to be, possibly, and I think it is of the McCarthyian vision, it is the ending that was always going to be and had to be. The violence reaching such a point that everything's black, ashen, and yet, at the absolute terminus of McCarthyian cosmic pessimism, is the place we find the most hope. So that's my review of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, who sadly passed away 3 days ago, which is why I've been doing this review today. So rest in peace, Cormac McCarthy, and thank you for all your great works, and thank you all for listening.